You know those moments in history that seem so absurd you'd swear someone made them up as a joke? Well, here's one that'll make you shake your head in disbelief. A German submarine, a marvel of wartime engineering, equipped with the latest technology, carrying dozens of trained sailors, armed with torpedoes capable of sinking enemy ships from miles away, met its end not from depth charges, not from Allied destroyers, not even from a lucky bomb hit. No, this submarine was brought down by something far more humble, far more unexpected, and honestly far more embarrassing. A toilet. Yes, you heard that right. A toilet sank a German U-boat in World War II. And before you think this is some kind of tall tale sailors made up over drinks, this actually happened. It's documented in naval records, and the story behind it is equal parts fascinating and tragic. April 1945. The war in Europe is winding down. Germany knows it's losing. The Allies are closing in from all sides, but the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, still has submarines prowling the waters around Britain and Scotland. These aren't the early war models either. By 1945, German U-boats have evolved into incredibly sophisticated machines. They're quieter, deeper diving, and packed with technology that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. One of these advanced submarines is U-1206, a Type VIIC U-boat that's been commissioned just a few months earlier. She's fresh, she's capable, and she's on her first real combat patrol. The captain is Karl Adolf Schlitt, a man with experience and training, ready to prove himself in combat. Everything about this mission should be routine for a submarine crew at this stage of the war. They know the risks, they know the enemy, and they've been trained on every system aboard the boat. But there's one system that's causing problems. One piece of equipment that nobody quite understands as well as they should. The toilet. Now, you might be wondering why a toilet would be complicated. After all, toilets have been around for centuries. But submarine toilets aren't like the one in your home. When you're underwater, sometimes hundreds of feet down, dealing with waste becomes a serious engineering challenge. You can't just flush everything into the ocean when the pressure outside the hull is trying to crush your submarine like a tin can. Early U-boats had relatively simple toilet systems, but they had a major drawback. Most toilets on submarines could only be used when the boat was on the surface or at shallow depths. This meant that during long patrols, especially when diving deep to avoid enemy ships, the crew had limited options. They'd have to hold it, or use a bucket, or wait until the submarine surfaced. Not exactly comfortable when you're stuck in a metal tube with 50 other men for weeks at a time. German engineers, being German engineers, decided to solve this problem. They developed what they called a high-pressure toilet system. This wasn't just a regular toilet. It was a complex piece of machinery with valves, pipes, and a very specific flushing procedure that had to be followed precisely. The idea was simple enough in theory. You do your business, then operate a series of valves in the correct sequence to equalize pressure and expel the waste overboard, even at depth. In practice, though, this system was finicky, complicated, and required training to operate properly. We're talking about multiple valves that had to be opened and closed in exactly the right order. Get it wrong and, well, you'll see where this is going. U-1206 is 8 days into her patrol. She's off the coast of Scotland near Peterhead, cruising at a depth of around 200 feet. That's deep enough to be safe from most surface threats, but not so deep that the pressure becomes dangerous. The crew is going about their normal routine. Some men are on watch, monitoring the hydrophones for enemy ships. Others are resting in their cramped bunks. The boat rocks gently with the ocean currents. It's actually a relatively peaceful moment in what's otherwise a very dangerous job. And then Captain Schlitt needs to use the facilities. Nothing unusual about that. Nature calls, even for submarine captains. He heads to the toilet, takes care of business, and then comes the crucial part: flushing. Now, Schlitt is an experienced officer, but like many of the crew, he hasn't been fully trained on this particular toilet system. These high-pressure toilets are relatively new. They've only been installed on the newest U-boats, and U-1206 is one of the first to have them. They're supposed to be a specialist, an enlisted man who's been trained specifically on operating these toilets. But Schlitt is the captain. He's not about to call for help with a toilet, so he tries to operate it himself. He turns the valves, follows what he thinks is the correct procedure, but something goes wrong. Maybe he opens the wrong valve first. Maybe he doesn't wait long enough between steps. The exact details are lost to history, but what happens next is crystal clear. Seawater starts flooding into the submarine. Not a trickle, not a slow leak. A powerful jet of water under 200 feet of pressure comes blasting through the toilet system into the submarine. The ocean, responding to the laws of physics, rushes in through the open valve, filling the compartment. Schlitt realizes immediately that something has gone terribly wrong. He tries to close the valves, tries to stop the flow, but he can't. The pressure is too great, the system is too complex, and he's made an error he can't reverse on his own. Within seconds, water is spreading across the floor of the compartment. The crew nearby hears the rushing water and immediately knows they have a serious problem. On a submarine, water where it shouldn't be is one of the most terrifying things you can experience. The specialist, the man who actually knows how to operate this toilet system, is summoned urgently. He rushes to the compartment, wading through water that's already ankle-deep and rising fast. He frantically works the valves, trying to stop the flooding, and eventually he manages to shut off the inflow. But by then, significant damage has been done. Water has spread through the compartment, and worse, much worse, it's reached the batteries directly below. Now, if you know anything about submarine operations, you know that batteries and salt water are a catastrophically bad combination. Submarines in World War II run on diesel engines when they're on the surface. But when they dive, they switch to electric motors powered by massive battery banks. These aren't the little batteries in your flashlight. These are huge lead-acid batteries, filled with sulfuric acid, capable of producing enormous amounts of electrical power. When salt water hits these batteries, chemistry takes over. The salt water reacts with the battery acid and produces chlorine gas. Not just a little bit of chlorine, but clouds of it, billowing up through the submarine. If you've ever accidentally mixed cleaning products and gotten a whiff of chlorine, you know how unpleasant it is. Now multiply that by 1,000 and trap it inside a sealed metal tube with 50 men. Chlorine gas is toxic. It burns your lungs, sears your throat, makes your eyes stream with tears. In high enough concentrations, it can kill you. And there's no escaping it because you're in a submarine, hundreds of feet underwater. The alarm sounds throughout U-1206. The crew knows immediately what's happening. Battery room flooding, chlorine gas. This is one of the nightmare scenarios every submariner trains for but prays never happens. Men scramble to their emergency stations, grabbing breathing apparatus, trying to contain the damage. But the gas is spreading fast through the boat's ventilation system. You can hear men coughing, choking, their eyes burning. The decision facing Captain Schlitt is brutal but simple. If they stay submerged, the chlorine gas will kill his entire crew. The submarine's air recycling system can't handle this kind of contamination. They have only one option: surface. Immediately. Never mind that they're in enemy-controlled waters off the coast of Scotland. Never mind that the Royal Air Force patrols these skies constantly. Never mind that surfacing a German U-boat in broad daylight in 1945 is essentially suicide. If they don't surface, they all die from the gas. At least on the surface, they have a chance. Schlitt gives the order. Blow all ballast tanks, emergency surface. The submarine, still partially flooded, sluggishly begins to rise. The crew holds on as U-1206 angles upward, climbing toward the surface. Inside the boat, it's chaos. Men are vomiting from the gas, others are barely conscious, everyone is struggling to breathe. The boat breaks through the surface with a great surge of water and foam, and immediately the hatches are thrown open. Fresh air, blessed fresh air, pours into the submarine. Men stumble onto the deck, gasping, coughing up the chlorine that's burned their lungs. Some collapse right there on the wet steel deck, just grateful to be breathing clean air again. But their relief lasts only moments. They're on the surface in enemy waters in daylight, and sure enough, within minutes they're spotted. A British aircraft on patrol sees the surfaced U-boat and immediately moves to attack. The crew of U-1206, still recovering from the chlorine gas, watches as the plane dives toward them. They can't dive again. The submarine is too damaged, still partially flooded, and filled with toxic gas. They can't fight. They're a submarine, not designed for surface combat with aircraft. All they can do is prepare to abandon ship. The British plane makes its attack run, and though accounts vary on whether it actually released weapons or if Schlitt decided to scuttle the boat before it could be captured, the end result is the same. Captain Schlitt gives the order to abandon ship and scuttle U-1206. The crew, those who are able, begins the frantic process of evacuating the submarine. They inflate life rafts, grab whatever supplies they can, and leap into the cold waters of the North Sea. The scuttling charges are set, valves are opened deliberately this time, and seawater begins pouring into U-1206 through multiple openings. The submarine that survived so much, that was built to withstand depth charge attacks and enemy torpedoes, is now being deliberately sunk by her own crew because of a toilet malfunction. The crew watches from their life rafts as U-1206 slowly settles deeper in the water. The bow dips down first, then the stern rises, and with a final rush of air and bubbles, she slips beneath the waves and disappears into the depths. For many of the men, this is their first combat patrol on this boat, and it's ending in the most absurd, most tragic way imaginable. The cold North Sea water is already sapping their strength. Some men are injured, others are sick from the chlorine gas, and all of them are exhausted. They're picked up eventually, some by British forces, some make it to shore on their own. The final toll is heartbreaking. 4 men die in this incident. 3 are killed during the evacuation, likely succumbing to the chlorine gas or drowning in the chaos. 1 crew member is killed in the aircraft attack. The rest, including Captain Schlitt, become prisoners of war. After the war, the story of U-1206 becomes something of a dark legend in naval circles. For the German Navy, it's an embarrassment, a reminder of how the complexity of their own technology betrayed them. For the British, it's an oddly satisfying footnote in the Battle of the Atlantic, proof that sometimes you don't need depth charges to sink a U-boat. For historians, it's a perfect example of how wars are won and lost not just by grand strategy and heroic battles, but by the smallest details, the most mundane failures. A toilet. The entire fate of that submarine and her crew came down to a toilet that was too complicated for its own good. What makes this story particularly poignant is the timing. April 1945. The war in Europe has less than a month left. Hitler will be dead in 3 weeks. Germany will surrender in early May. These men didn't die storming the beaches of Normandy or in the great tank battles on the Eastern Front. They didn't die in a desperate last stand defending Berlin. They died, or at least their submarine was lost, because someone couldn't operate a toilet correctly. It feels almost cruel, like a cosmic joke at the expense of these sailors who were just trying to do their jobs. But there's a deeper lesson here, one that resonates far beyond World War II and German submarines. It's about the danger of over-engineering, of making things so complicated that they become unreliable. The Germans were masters of engineering during the war. Their tanks were incredibly powerful but prone to breaking down because they were too complex. Their jet aircraft were revolutionary but required constant maintenance. And their high-pressure toilet system was brilliant in concept but a disaster in practice. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. Sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel or, in this case, the toilet. The wreck of U-1206 remained lost for decades. The exact location was uncertain. The North Sea is deep and murky, and there were so many U-boats sunk during the war that finding one specific wreck was nearly impossible. But in recent years, with advances in sonar and underwater surveying, maritime archaeologists have located what they believe to be U-1206, resting on the seabed right where the historical record said she went down. The submarine is now a war grave, a metal tomb for the men who died aboard her, and it's protected under international maritime law. No one is allowed to disturb it, to salvage it, or to dive on it without special permission. It sits there in the darkness, a monument to one of the strangest losses in naval history. For the survivors, life after U-1206 was complicated. Captain Schlitz spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp, then returned to Germany after the surrender. You have to wonder what that was like, how he processed being the captain who lost his submarine to a toilet. In his official report to British interrogators, he was apparently quite candid about what happened, though you can imagine the mix of shame and disbelief he must have felt telling that story. The other survivors scattered. Some remained in Germany, some emigrated. All carried the memory of that terrible day when everything went wrong in the most unexpected way. The story of U-1206 has taken on a life of its own over the years. It appears in books about unusual military disasters, in documentaries about World War II submarines, in forums where history enthusiasts debate the details. Some people don't believe it actually happened. It seems too ridiculous, too perfectly ironic. But the records are there, the German naval archives confirm it, the British records mention it, and most tellingly, the survivors told consistent stories about what occurred. This wasn't a myth or a legend, this was real, and it really was as absurd as it sounds. There's something almost Shakespearean about the whole thing, isn't there? The mighty brought low by the mundane. The warrior defeated not by his enemy but by his own equipment. Throughout history, we've seen this pattern repeat. Napoleon, one of the greatest military minds in history, partially defeated by the Russian winter and bad logistics. The Spanish Armada, the most powerful fleet of its age, wrecked by storms as much as by English cannons. And U-1206, a technological marvel, sent to the bottom by a malfunctioning toilet. It reminds us that in war, as in life, it's often not the big dramatic moments that get you, it's the small things, the details, the mundane failures that cascade into disasters. For the families of the men who died, the explanation must have been almost unbearable. Your loved one didn't die in combat, didn't go down fighting the enemy, didn't even have the dignity of being sunk by an enemy weapon. He died because of a plumbing failure. How do you process that? How do you find meaning or honor in such a senseless loss? War is full of these kinds of deaths, the unheroic ones, the accidents, the mistakes, the random bad luck. We like to remember the heroic sacrifices, the brave last stands, the dramatic moments. But most deaths in war aren't like that. Most are just sad, wasteful, and pointless. The engineers who designed that high-pressure toilet system probably never imagined it would lead to the loss of a submarine. They were solving a real problem, trying to improve the lives of submariners who had to endure terrible conditions. Their intentions were good, their solution was clever, but the implementation was flawed. It required too much training, had too many steps, left too much room for human error. And when that human error occurred, the consequences were catastrophic. It's a lesson that applies to so many fields beyond military engineering. How often do we create systems that are technically impressive but practically unusable? How often do we prioritize complexity over simplicity, sophistication over reliability? The men of U-1206 were professionals, trained sailors who knew their jobs. They weren't incompetent or careless. They were victims of a system that failed them, a piece of equipment that was too clever for its own good. And that's perhaps the saddest part of this story. It was preventable. If the toilet system had been simpler, if there had been better training, if the captain had swallowed his pride and called for the specialist immediately, if any one of a dozen small things had gone differently, U-1206 might have survived the war. Those 4 men might have gone home to their families. The whole incident might never have happened. But history doesn't work on might-have-beens. What happened, happened. U-1206 went down because of a toilet, 4 men died, and the rest became prisoners. And now, 80 years later, we tell this story not to mock those men or to laugh at their misfortune, but to remember them and to learn from what happened. War is full of incomprehensible violence and deliberate destruction, but sometimes it's the accidental tragedies, the bizarre mishaps, the absurd disasters that hit hardest because they feel so unnecessary, so preventable, so cruelly random. So the next time you hear someone say that truth is stranger than fiction, remember U-1206. Remember the German submarine that survived convoy battles, depth charge attacks, and months of dangerous patrol duty, only to be defeated by its own toilet. Remember the captain who made a simple mistake with catastrophic consequences. Remember the crew who died not in glorious combat, but in a frantic, chaotic evacuation caused by something as mundane as a plumbing failure. Their story deserves to be told, not as a joke or a curiosity, but as a reminder of the human cost of war and the sometimes cruel randomness of fate. That submarine still rests on the bottom of the North Sea, a tomb and a monument, holding its secrets in the cold, dark water, testament to one of the strangest and saddest losses in the entire Second World War.